The 17th of January 1940. Halifax Harbour, Nova Scotia. The wind cuts across the grey Atlantic like a blade forged in Arctic ice. Snow drifts across the wooden piers, muffling the groan of cranes and the shouts of dock workers bundled in wool coats stained with engine grease. In the harbour, 19 merchant ships swing at anchor, their hulls streaked with rust and salt, their engines cold. They are not warships, they are not sleek, they are tramp steamers, aging freighters, coal-burning relics of a previous war vessels that should have been retired a decade ago but now find themselves pressed into service once more. Their average speed, 9 knots. Barely faster than a man could row across a calm lake if he had the stamina and the hours to spare. The Convoy Commodore, a Royal Navy captain with 3 decades at sea and a face carved by wind and disappointment, stands on the bridge of the lead ship and stares at the manifest in his hand. 72 hours to assemble, 4,000 miles to cross, and every hour at sea is an hour the U-boats have to find them. He folds the paper carefully, tucks it into his coat, and lights a cigarette. The smoke rises thin and white against the falling snow. Somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, German submarines are already moving into position, their commanders studying charts, calculating intercept courses, waiting. The convoy will sail at dawn. It will sail slowly, and the ocean, vast and indifferent, will decide who reaches the other side. This is not a battle. Not yet. This is logistics. And in January of 1940, logistics is a problem America does not yet know how to solve. The United States in early 1940 is not at war. It is not neutral, either not truly. It is suspended in a strange twilight, a nation watching Europe burn from across an ocean that suddenly feels narrower than it did a year ago. France has not yet fallen, the Blitz has not yet begun, but Poland is gone, swallowed in 5 weeks by the Wehrmacht and the Red Army, and the British Expeditionary Force is dug in along the Belgian border, waiting for the spring thaw and the German offensive everyone knows is coming. In Washington, debates rage in Congress about aid, about intervention, about whether the Atlantic is shield enough. In the War Department, a different debate is taking place. It is quieter, more technical, and it concerns a problem that will not wait for consensus. America has no fast sealift capacity. The term itself is bureaucratic, bloodless, the kind of phrase that lives in logistics manuals and budget hearings. But strip it down, and the reality is stark. The United States in 1940 does not possess the merchant fleet necessary to move large quantities of men, equipment, and supplies across an ocean quickly. The ships exist, thousands of them, registered under American, British, Norwegian, Dutch, Greek flags, but they are not fast. They are not standardized. They are not organized into a system that can sustain a modern industrialized war on another continent. They are the maritime equivalent of a patchwork quilt, functional, familiar, but utterly inadequate for what is coming. The average speed of a loaded cargo ship in 1940 is between 8 and 12 knots, depending on the vessel, the weather, and how long it has been since the boilers were cleaned. 12 knots is just over 13 miles per hour. To cross the Atlantic from New York to Liverpool, roughly 3,000 nautical miles, takes a ship moving at 10 knots approximately 12.5 days. If the weather is good, if the engines hold, if nothing goes wrong, add convoy procedures, zigzagging to avoid submarines, delays for stragglers, and the crossing stretches to 2 weeks or more. 2 weeks is an eternity in war. 2 weeks is enough time for an army to be encircled, a city to fall, a front to collapse. 2 weeks is enough time for a convoy to be hunted, found, and destroyed. And so, in the first months of 1940, the question becomes, how do you move a war across an ocean when your ships are too slow, too few, and too vulnerable? The answer, it turns out, is not to build faster ships. Not yet. There is no time for that. The answer is to rewrite the rules of convoy logistics entirely. The convoy system is not new. It is ancient, older than steam, older than cannon, older than the compass. For as long as ships have carried cargo worth stealing, they have travelled in groups for protection. The The Spanish treasure fleets of the 16th century moved in convoy. The East India Company organized its merchant ships into escorted formations. During the First World War, the Royal Navy relearned what centuries of maritime history had already taught: that a merchant ship sailing alone is easy prey, but a merchant ship sailing with 50 others, surrounded by destroyers and corvettes, is a problem even for a submarine. The convoy system saved Britain in 1917. It will save Britain again in 1940, but convoys are slow. By definition, by necessity, a convoy moves at the speed of its slowest ship, and in 1940, the slowest ships are very slow indeed. A modern destroyer can make 35 knots, a fleet oiler can make 15. But a coal-burning tramp steamer built in 1918 and barely maintained since? 8 knots, if the chief engineer is good and the coal is decent. Maybe 9, if the sea is calm. And so the entire convoy destroyers, corvettes, freighters, tankers, crawls across the Atlantic at the pace of the weakest link. This is not inefficiency. This is survival, because a convoy that leaves ships behind is a convoy that sacrifices them. A straggler is a gift to the U-boats. A lone freighter, falling behind because her engines failed or her captain misjudged the weather, is a target that cannot defend itself and cannot run. The wolf packs know this. They circle the edges of convoys like sharks following a wounded school of fish, waiting for one to drift away. And so the convoy stays together. No matter how slowly it must move, no matter how many extra days the crossing takes, because the alternative is unthinkable. But slow convoys create other problems. The longer a convoy is at sea, the more fuel it burns. The more fuel it burns, the more tankers are needed to supply the escorts. The more tankers in the convoy, the larger the target. The larger the target, the more submarines are drawn to it. The more submarines, the more escorts are needed. And round the logic goes, a spiral of logistics and risk that has no clean solution, only trade-offs. In early 1940, the Royal Navy is learning these trade-offs the hard way. Convoys are being organized out of Halifax, out of Sydney, out of Freetown and Gibraltar and Alexandria. They sail on schedules measured in weeks, their departure times staggered to avoid overwhelming the port facilities on the other end. Each convoy is designated by a code: HX for fast convoys from Halifax, SC for slow convoys, ON for outbound convoys returning empty to North America. The codes are simple, efficient, and within months they will be spoken in German wardrooms as U-boat commanders plot their intercepts. HX 84, SC 7, ON 207, numbers that will become synonyms for disaster, for triumph, for the grinding attrition of the Atlantic War. But in January 1940, the system is still taking shape, the rules are still being written, and the Americans, not yet belligerents, are watching closely. The United States Merchant Marine in 1940 is a shadow of what it was in 1920. After the First World War, the government sold off hundreds of surplus cargo ships to private operators at bargain prices, hoping to build a competitive commercial fleet. It did not work. American ships were expensive to operate, American crews were expensive to hire, and American regulations were stricter than those of foreign registries. By the mid-1932s, ship owners were reflagging vessels under Panamanian and Honduran colors to avoid labor laws and taxes. The result was predictable. The American merchant fleet shrank, and the ships that remained were old, slow, and increasingly uncompetitive. Then came 1939, and suddenly the calculus changed. War in Europe meant demand for cargo capacity. Demand meant higher freight rates. Higher rates meant profit. And profit, at last, made American shipping viable again. But viability is not the same as readiness. The ships are still old. The crews are still small. And the infrastructure, the ports, the repair yards, the supply chains, is not designed for the scale of mobilization that is coming. In Washington, a few planners see the problem clearly. They are not generals. They are not admirals. They are logistics officers, the kind of men who think in tonnage and turnaround times, who understand that wars are won not by the army with the most courage, but by the army that can be supplied. They look at the numbers, and they see a crisis in slow motion. Britain will need food. Britain will need fuel. Britain will need steel, copper, aluminum, rubber, cotton, explosives, rifles, shells, aircraft, tanks, trucks, boots, bandages, and 10,000 other things in quantities that strain comprehension. And all of it will have to cross the Atlantic on ships that are too slow, too few, and too exposed. The solution, they realize, cannot be purely military. It must be industrial. It must be systemic. And it must begin now, before the United States is formally at war, because once the shooting starts, there will be no time to build the infrastructure from scratch. And so, quietly, the work begins. The first problem is speed, or rather, the lack of it. A ship that takes 2 weeks to cross the Atlantic is a ship that makes, at best, 26 round trips per year. More realistically, accounting for loading and unloading time, maintenance, and weather delays, a ship makes perhaps 15 or 16 trips annually. This is not efficient. This is barely adequate. And if the U-boats begin sinking ships faster than they can be replaced, which, by 1941, they will then, the math becomes catastrophic. The ideal solution is to build faster ships, ships that can outrun submarines, ships that can cross the Atlantic in 7 or 8 days instead of 14, ships with the range and reliability to make the journey without constant mechanical failures. But fast ships are expensive. Fast ships require advanced engines, better steel, more skilled labor. Fast ships take time to design and time to build, and time is the one resource no one has in surplus. The compromise in 1940 is this. You cannot make the old ships faster, but you can make the convoys more efficient. This means better organization, standardized loading procedures so that cargo ships spend less time in port, pre-positioned supplies so that escorts do not have to detour for fuel, improved weather forecasting so that convoys can avoid storms that would slow them down or scatter them, centralized routing so that convoys do not waste time or fuel on inefficient courses, and, most critically, better intelligence about where the U-boats are so that convoys can be routed around them instead of through them. None of this is glamorous. None of it involves heroism or daring. It is paperwork and schedules and radio codes. It is clerks in London and New York plotting courses on charts, calculating fuel consumption, tracking ship arrivals, coordinating with port authorities. It is the unglamorous, invisible labor of logistics, and it is as vital to the war effort as any battle. But even perfect logistics cannot overcome the fundamental constraint. The ships are still too slow. The British, in early 1940, are acutely aware of this. They have been fighting the U-boats for 6 months, and already the losses are mounting. In September 1939, the first day of the war, the passenger liner Athenia was torpedoed off the coast of Ireland, killing 117 people, including 28 Americans. It was a violation of international law. Passenger ships were supposed to be off-limits, but it set the tone for what was coming. In the months that followed, the sinkings continued. Merchant ships, tankers, fishing trawlers. Some were sailing in convoy, but many were still sailing independently because there were not yet enough escorts to protect every ship and because the convoy system was still being organized. By January 1940, the Royal Navy is beginning to impose order on the chaos. Convoys are now mandatory for most transatlantic traffic. Ships are organized by speed, fast convoys, slow convoys, and a special category for independently routed ships that are fast enough and valuable enough to risk sailing alone. Escorts are assigned based on threat level. Light protection in coastal waters, heavier protection in the mid-Atlantic gap where land-based aircraft cannot reach. The system is not perfect, it cannot be, not yet, but it is improving. And then, in the spring of 1940, everything changes. April, May, June. The German offensive in the west unfolds with a speed and violence that shocks the world. Norway falls, Denmark falls. The Netherlands, Belgium, France all collapse in a matter of weeks. The British Expeditionary Force is evacuated from Dunkirk in a miracle of improvisation and luck, but the equipment is left behind. tanks, trucks, artillery, rifles, an entire army's worth of materiel, abandoned on the beaches or destroyed to keep it out of German hands. And now Britain stands alone, an island nation with no allies on the continent, facing an enemy that controls the entire western coastline of Europe, from the Arctic Circle to the Spanish border. The strategic implications are immediate and devastating. Every port in occupied Europe, Brest, Lorient, Saint-Nazaire, Bordeaux, is now available to the U-boats. They no longer have to return to German bases in the North Sea to refuel and rearm. They can operate from French ports, cutting days off their transit time, extending their patrol endurance, increasing the number of boats that can be on station in the Atlantic at any given time. The mid-Atlantic gap, the area beyond the range of British and Canadian aircraft, becomes a killing ground. And the convoys, slow and exposed, become targets. The men aboard the merchant ships do not think in terms of grand strategy. They think in terms of the horizon, the weather, the next watch, the next port. They are not soldiers. They are sailors, civilians in most cases, men who signed on for wages and the promise of steady work, not for war. Many of them are veterans of the First World War, old enough to remember the last time the Atlantic was a battlefield. Others are young, fresh out of maritime academies or off the docks, drawn by the high pay that comes with hazardous duty. They come from everywhere: Britain, Canada, Norway, Greece, Poland, the United States. Some are unionized, some are not. Some are idealists, determined to do their part. Others are pragmatists, here for the money and hoping to survive long enough to spend it. They live in cramped quarters below the waterline, in compartments that stink of oil and sweat and damp wool. They eat the same meals day after day: tinned beef, hardtack, tea so strong it could strip paint. They stand watch in 4-hour shifts, scanning the horizon for periscopes, listening to the escort's sonar pings, feeling the ship shudder every time the engines change speed or the rudder swings to follow the zigzag pattern. They do not talk much about the U-boats. There is no point. Either the torpedo finds you or it does not, and there is nothing a merchant sailor can do about it, except hope that the escorts are good and the lookouts are sharp and the weather is too rough for submarines to attack. But they know the odds. Everyone knows the odds. In 1940, a merchant sailor in the North Atlantic has a 1 in 4 chance of being torpedoed at some point during the war. If the ship is hit, he has perhaps 2 minutes to reach the lifeboats, assuming the lifeboats are still intact, assuming the ship does not capsize or explode, assuming the sea is not too rough to launch them. If he makes it into a lifeboat, he can expect to survive perhaps 6 hours in the winter Atlantic before hypothermia takes him. In summer, if he is lucky, he might last a day. Rescue is not guaranteed. Convoys do not stop to pick up survivors. Stopping makes them targets. The escorts will try, if they can, but they have orders to stay with the convoy, to protect the ships that are still afloat, not to linger over the ones that are already lost. This is the bargain. This is the trade. And the men who sail the convoys understand it, even if they do not speak it aloud. Back in the United States, the machinery of logistics is beginning to turn. It is still 1940. America is not yet at war, but the rhetoric is shifting. Roosevelt speaks of the arsenal of democracy, and the phrase resonates because it captures something true. That America's greatest contribution to the war will not be its soldiers, not at first, but its factories. The capacity to produce ships, planes, tanks, guns, shells, boots, tents, rations, fuel everything an army needs to fight in quantities that dwarf what any other nation can manage. But production is meaningless without transportation. A tank built in Detroit is useless if it cannot be delivered to a British port. A shell forged in Pennsylvania might as well not exist if it cannot reach the front lines. And so the question returns, again and again: how do you move a war across an ocean? The answer begins to take shape in shipyards along the East Coast and the Gulf of Mexico. New designs are drawn up, simplified versions of existing cargo ships, optimized for mass production rather than elegance. They will be called Liberty ships, and they will be built in sections that can be welded together in assembly line fashion, cutting construction time from months to weeks. They will not be fast 10 or 11 knots, barely faster than the ships they replace, but they will be numerous, and in war, numbers matter. By the end of the conflict, American shipyards will have produced more than 2,700 Liberty ships, a feat of industrial output unmatched in history. But that is years away. In 1940, the Liberty ship program is still in the planning stages. The first keels will not be laid until 1941. The first ships will not be launched until late that year. Until then, the convoys must make do with what they have. Old ships, slow ships, ships that break down and fall behind and become prey. There is a rhythm to convoy life, a monotony that is both comforting and suffocating. The ships sail in columns, spaced a few hundred yards apart, the escorts circling the perimeter like sheepdogs herding a flock. The convoy moves at the speed dictated by the Commodore, usually 7 or 8 knots, and the ships adjust their engines to match. It is harder than it sounds. Every ship handles differently. Some respond quickly to throttle changes, others lag. Some drift to port in heavy seas, others to starboard. Keeping station requires constant attention, constant adjustment, constant vigilance. A ship that drifts too close to its neighbour risks collision. A ship that falls too far behind risks being left alone. At night, the convoy runs dark. No lights, no signals except the faint glow of a shielded lamp on the stern of the ship ahead, just bright enough for the helmsman to follow. The darkness is absolute. Cloud cover hides the stars. The sea is black glass, reflecting nothing. The only sounds are the engines, the wind, the creak of the hull. The escorts are out there, somewhere, invisible, their presence felt more than seen. Every hour, the convoy changes course, zigzagging according to a pre-arranged schedule, making it harder for a U-boat to calculate an intercept. The maneuver is mechanical, routine, but it breaks the monotony just enough to keep the watch officers alert. Days blur together. The ocean is empty. Sometimes a whale surfaces, blows, dives. Sometimes a storm rolls in, and the ships pitch and heave and the convoy scatters, each vessel fighting to stay afloat, and when the weather clears they must find each other again, reassemble, resume the crossing. Sometimes there is nothing at all, just water, just horizon, just the slow, grinding passage of miles. And then, sometimes, there is a torpedo. The sound comes first, a dull thud, muffled by distance and water, but unmistakable. Then the explosion, a column of water and steam rising from the side of a ship 2 columns over. The ship lists immediately, her cargo shifting, her hull ruptured, seawater pouring into her holds. Smoke pours from her stack. Her engines stop. She begins to settle, bow first, stern lifting out of the water, her propeller spinning uselessly in the air. The lifeboats are lowered, if there is time. Men jump into the sea, if there is no time. The escorts converge, searching for the U-boat, dropping depth charges in a pattern that churns the water white. The convoy does not stop. The convoy never stops. It continues on, leaving the sinking ship behind, leaving the lifeboats and the swimmers and the wreckage to the mercy of the escorts and the sea. By the time the sun sets, the ship is gone. By morning, no one speaks of it. There is nothing to say. The convoy is smaller now, the ocean is larger, and the crossing continues. The Americans, watching from the other side of neutrality, see these losses and understand that preparation is not enough. Logistics is not enough. Even production is not enough. What is needed is a fundamental rethinking of how naval war is fought in the industrial age. The old rules, the rules that governed naval combat in the age of sail, in the age of steam, even in the First World War, are obsolete. This war will not be won by battleships dueling at 20,000 yards. It will be won by merchant ships that make it to port, by escorts that keep the sea lanes open, by supply chains that do not break. And so, in offices and war rooms far from the Atlantic, the groundwork is laid for what will become the most sophisticated logistical operation in history. New technologies are developed: radar to detect submarines on the surface, sonar to track them underwater, direction-finding equipment to intercept their radio transmissions. New tactics are tested: hunter-killer groups that actively seek out U-boats instead of passively defending convoys, escort carriers that extend air cover into the mid-Atlantic gap, forward-fueling bases in Iceland and Greenland that shorten the escort's transit times. New doctrines are written: manuals on anti-submarine warfare, protocols for convoy organization, training programs for escort commanders, and new ships are built, not just Liberty ships, but destroyers and destroyer escorts and corvettes, vessels designed specifically for the grinding, unglamorous work of convoy defense. None of this happens overnight. None of it is easy. But it happens, piece by piece, month by month, because the alternative is defeat. By the end of 1940, the convoy system is no longer an improvisation. It is an institution. The schedules are published, the routes are mapped, the procedures are standardized. Convoys sail from Halifax every 8 days, from Sydney every 10, from New York when the Americans finally enter the war. They sail in all weather, in all seasons, through storms and fog and ice. They are attacked, and they suffer losses, but they keep sailing, because there is no alternative, because Britain's survival depends on it, because the war, ultimately, will be decided not on the battlefield, but in the hold of a cargo ship, in the fuel tank of a destroyer, in the warehouse of a port. The men who sail the convoys do not see themselves as heroes. They see themselves as workers, doing a job, earning a wage, trying to stay alive. But they are the reason Britain does not starve. They are the reason the factories stay open, the tanks keep rolling, the planes keep flying. They are the reason the war can be fought at all. And when historians, decades later, look back and try to explain how the Allies won, they will point to many things: industrial capacity, technological innovation, strategic leadership. But they will also point to this: to the convoys, to the slow, vulnerable ships that cross the Atlantic again and again, through waters haunted by submarines, carrying the material that made victory possible. In the end, the lesson of 1940 is not about speed, it is about endurance. It is about the willingness to accept that some problems cannot be solved quickly, cannot be solved with a single brilliant stroke, but must be solved slowly, methodically, with patience and persistence, and the grim understanding that the work will be hard and the losses will be heavy, and there is no guarantee of success. The convoys are slow because they must be slow. They are vulnerable because the ocean is vast and the enemy is patient. But they sail anyway. And in their sailing, in their stubborn refusal to be stopped, they become something more than ships. They become a symbol of what industrial democracy can achieve when it is tested. They become proof that logistics, unglamorous and unheroic, is the foundation on which all other victories rest. America had no fast sealift in 1940, but America learned to sail anyway. And in that learning, in that slow crossing, in that rewriting of the rules of war at sea, a new kind of strength was forged. Not the strength of speed, but the strength of will. Not the strength to win quickly, but the strength to endure, to adapt, to keep moving forward, even when the horizon is empty and the sea is cold and the enemy is always, always out there waiting. The convoys sail on. They always have, they always will, and in their wake, the war is won.